in terms of dollar to value, I'd say Fuji got to win it. Hey friends, in this video I want to talk about a couple of equivalently priced cameras across 3 different brands that are offering 3 different value propositions: the Canon 80D, the Fuji X-T20, and the Sony Alpha 6300. Let's get into it. I first off want to kind of speak to that cost bit. The 80D is at $1,100, the X-T20 is at about $1,000, the 6300's at $900 or so. So these are all in about the same price range. So that's why I feel like I can speak to them as relatively equivalent. They have the same sensor size. They have very similar like dynamic range and high ISO performance, just ISO performance. They have similar dynamic range at equivalent ISOs. So they're really quite similar cameras from a sensor perspective, from a very just raw image quality perspective. But there's a lot more to each of those. And with that said, I think what I want to start with next is device versus system. And this is a conversation I've had in a couple of other videos, but I want to dive into that with these 3 in particular. And then I want to get into features, lenses, durability, and your dollar to value ratio. And I think that'll be a good, overall look at these 3 devices and these 3 brands at this price segment. So in thinking about device versus system, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, what is a device and what is a system? A device, in my view, is just the body and the kit lens, and a system is saying, well, I'm going to buy into lenses. I'm going to buy into buying lenses into this brand, into this sensor size, in order to get the most I can out of this camera. I'm going to choose this camera as an investment, or this brand or this lens mount as an investment for the future. And so when we're thinking about the 80D as a device, it has a lot of, great things about it. DPAF, very highly lauded, potentially, in my view at any rate, not quite as great as a lot of people like to make it out to be, because they use Canon more than I would recommend perhaps, but DPAF is a big point. A 3-inch tilty flippy touchscreen, that's another big plus. A big bright viewfinder, not perhaps as big as a full frame camera, not perhaps as bright as an EVF, but as far as optical viewfinders go, it's pretty swell, right? And that's perhaps an antiquated term, but I think it's accurate. It's a great viewfinder. It's a great menu system. While the X-T20 shares a lot of those features, it also, gives a little bit greater creative flexibility, makes you feel more like you're involved in the process of shooting. And the 6300 takes a lot of things out of your hands if you want it to. They all do, to an extent, right? But the 6300's creative ceiling is very, very high. And so where I want to kind of go next with this is, the specific lenses, the specific features. So the kit lenses on the 80D and the Alpha 6300 are basically we're throwing away and getting better versions of. However, the kit lens on the X-T20 is actually really good. At f2.8 to f4, it's faster through the focal range than either of the other 2 kit lenses. Optically, it's sharper than the other 2 kit lenses. It's a much better value for money, and as a result, you're going to get a bigger upcharge when you buy it kit, but it's also going to retain its value a lot better and a lot longer. In terms of other features for stills, you're going to get 24 megapixels across the board. You're going to get really good dynamic range across the board. You're going to get better dynamic range in the 6300 than the X-T20 or the 80D, but you're going to get DPAF on the 80D, while you're going to get 325 phase detect autofocus points and 425 phase detect autofocus points in the X-T20 and the Alpha 6300 respectively. So your autofocus is going to be really well taken care of. And in terms of stills, you're going to still get 45 cross-type autofocus points on your 80D, and they're going to do really well for you. They're not going to do as well as the other 2 systems, but in live view, it's about similar. In terms of video, you're only getting 1080p 60 on your 80D, and you're going to get 4K on the Fuji and Sony alternatives. Now, the 4K on the Fuji is not oversampled like it is on the 6300, and so the 6300's 4K is going to be much better than the 4K the X-T20. So that X-T20 has 4K. It's good. It's good that it has 4K, but that 4K is going to be more useful at 1080 than it is going to be at 4K, whereas the 6300 at 4K is going to still be a really sharp, really usable image. It's not going to be a professional bitrate, but 100 megabits a second is nothing to sneeze at either. None of these cameras have internal stabilization. Now, depending on how you feel about internal stabilization, be it EIS or IBIS, internal stabilization is kind of important. With the Sony line, you can bump up to the 6500 for another $400 or so, $500 or so, depending on where and when you get it. And that internal stabilization is going to make a big difference. But since you don't have it on your 6300, since you don't have it on your XT20 or on your ADD, why am I bringing it up? I'm bringing it up because when you want to apply warp stabilizer in post, you might get a little bit of a jelly effect on each of them, perhaps. Your rolling shutter is going to amplify that on your 6300, but you're going to have more resolution to play with, so that when it gets cut down, you're still going to have a really good 1080p image, which is on average what people are viewing YouTube at in particular, which means that you're going to have a much better 1080p option, even if you're going to export at 4K with it cropped down for that stabilization. So from there, kind of walking into stills features. The stills features, I feel like they're all pretty much the same. I feel like, you might benefit from having the hundreds more autofocus points on the XT20 and the Alpha 6300, but on the other hand, I'm still coming from an XS and a 6D. I'm really comfortable with an autofocus spread that's a little bit tighter and focus recompose, and it makes me a little uncomfortable sometimes, even on my 6300 after having owned it for nearly a year, to just let the whole wide field be open to it to choose for itself. So I still like manipulating where that focus is, and I feel like that focus recompose is still a really strong option on your ADD. I feel like you don't need to take those 45 autofocus points as a really huge hit, but it is also because that's going to reduce your autofocus speed in a variety of manners, right? And your DPAF, though, is going to pull some of that back in video or live view, but you're also going to take a hit on your frame rate. And talking about frame rate, you're going to get 7 FPS, which is pretty good. On your ADD, you're going to get pretty good frame rate, 8 or 9, I believe, on the XT20, but you're also going to get up to 11 on your 6300, so if fast action is your thing, that seems like a clear winner for the Alpha 6300. But now that we've kind of walked through the features, and they all kind of have their merits, I want to talk about lenses. Now, going back to features for just a hot second, I feel like the 6300 is the winner for me because I own one and I love it. But the XT20 I feel like is a very strong contender in that field. I feel like the ADD is suffering from a fundamental lack of 4K. I feel like you need 4K on an APS-C body nowadays in order to be relevant, and I don't believe that the ADD is relevant as a result of that. I feel like the size, the form factor, makes it less approachable. I feel like that size of a DSLR really can get in a lot of people's way if you're wanting to take portraits. I feel like that can get between you and them much more easily than the size of an XT20 or an Alpha 6300. But on the other hand, an ADD is still going to take a really good still, and if you want to put it out in the rain, you'll still be fine, whereas you won't with an XT20 or a 6300. So for me, the winner is very clear, but for you, it might not be. And I'd love it if you'd comment below and let me know what your winner between these three could be just off of an on-paper features set. But talking about lenses, the ADD benefits from the huge EF and EFS lens lineup that Canon offers, and really the EFS lenses are a huge, benefit to them because you're getting a lot of value for not as much money as you're going to have to spend for your Alpha 6300 or your XT20. Now, the lenses on your Alpha 6300, the native Sony and Zeiss APS-C E-mount lenses are going to be really good. They're going to be as good or better optically as your EFS lenses. However, the Fuji's X-mount lenses are far superior to the both of them. They're much more intentionally designed. They're intentionally designed to be comfortable with equivalence. And what I mean by that is, one of the more popular lenses that is sold for X-mount is the 23mm and the 35mm, I believe. And what those are in terms of equivalence is 35 and 50mm. And their apertures at f2 or f1.4, depending on which one you want to go with, are equivalent up, so that you're only going to lose a third of a stop of light in that transition into a full frame equivalent. So your 23 turns into 35, your 23 f2 turns into an equivalent 35 f2.2 or f2.5, so it's still a fast lens. Your 35 f2 turns into a 50 f2.2 or f2.5, kind of in the middle there. And if you want to go with the f1.4s, that'll just turn into an f1.8 in terms of equivalence. And so you're going to get full frame image quality on your X-T20 much more easily. It's much easier to get that equivalence on a Fuji body than it is on either the Canons or the Sonys of the world. However, there are more fast primes available for the Sony system, and the slower but really reliable zooms are, like the 18-105, are fantastically well built. They're really good optical quality, and they're going to serve you really well. That 18-105 f4 in particular, all internal. It's not going to move. It's not going to zoom out, which is a really great thing. And once you start going internal zoom, you'll never go back. I promise. It's wonderful. So in terms of lenses, it seems like a bit of a tie, but I feel like the Sony system takes a hit for, the price. The price point on those APS-C E-mount lenses are not good. The price point on the EFS lenses are very good, but the optical quality isn't quite there by comparison to the Fuji lenses. So I think I'm going to have to give Fuji the win on the lenses while I gave Sony the win on the features. So let's see if Canon can pull it out in durability, which, spoiler alert, it does, because Canon builds fantastically durable cameras. I took a couple of mine out recently and shot just in the rain for several days, and I didn't have to worry about it at all. I had a weather sealed body, I had a weather sealed lens, and the durability of Canon weather sealing is remarkable. You're going to be able to trust that device no matter what. I wouldn't recommend dropping it. I wouldn't recommend submerging it. I wouldn't recommend any of that. But if you're finding yourself in inclement weather, if you're finding yourself with your tripod falling over into some mud, you're probably going to be all right if you're shooting Canon. Probably not going to be all right if you're shooting Sony. And you might be, but it's not quite as sure of a thing if you're shooting Fuji. So Canon wins out on durability there. In terms of the dollar to value ratio, these are all kind of in the same range. So where a lot of it comes back in is that the feature sets and the lenses, and thinking about also that device versus system. Do you buy into Canon's system? Do you buy into EF and EFS lenses? Do you buy into Fuji lenses? Do you buy into Sony lenses? Considering these as a whole, I don't buy into APS-C E-mount lenses. I don't think they're worth very much of anything. I'd rather get Sigma Art lenses and adapt them. The lens that I'm using right now is a Sigma 30mm f1.4. It is native mount, but it's not Sony native mount because it's substantially cheaper than the 35 f1.8 OSS, because I don't feel like spending that kind of money on an APS-C prime that I don't know if I'm going to want in a couple of years. I might just go ahead and go full frame if I'm going to keep on with Sony. Now with Fuji, you're not ever going to go full frame. You might go medium format, but at that point, it's not really, there's no point in talking about it because medium format lenses are totally different from full frame lenses in the first place. But the lenses that you're going to have on your X-mount system are going to be really good. But the problem that you're going to have to worry about there is, are you buying an older lens or a newer lens? The older lenses don't focus as quickly as the newer lenses do. Those newer lenses are built for these newer, faster autofocus bodies. So when you're thinking about, the dollar to value ratio, you're going to have to think, maybe I'm going to go for that slightly slower f2 lens instead of the 1.4, because although it's slower in terms of light performance, in terms of that aperture, it's going to be faster with autofocus. But finally, the Canon system, while it's really durable and can stand up to harsh weather, it can't stand up to the competition in terms of feature sets and in terms of lenses. While really cheap, the EFS lenses oftentimes don't start until the apertures don't go any lower than f2.8, and oftentimes they'll start at f3.5 or smaller. So you're not going to be able to get the same depth of field, the same control over depth of field. You're never going to approach equivalence with APS-C lenses on an ADD. So while Canon Color Science produces really great and vibrant reds and oranges to really capture skin tones in a nuanced way, you're going to be able to color edit your Fuji and your Sony files to match. I've done that fairly successfully a number of times, and one of the things that really stands out to me is that you're getting a much better dynamic range on your 6300 And on your Fuji, you're going to have some really excellent film simulations that'll really make you feel like you're, back in the world of film. And that's a really good thing in my view. I feel like that really kind of gets back at the core of what photography is. I feel like Fuji gets back at what the core of photography is much more than these other two brands. So in terms of dollar to value ratio, in my view, if I were on the market to buy a camera right now, I'd say the X-T20 or the X-T2 wins it. I think Fuji as a brand wins it. Because in terms of APS-C cameras, there isn't a system that I'd rather buy into right now than Fuji, because I think what they're doing is they're making a lot of users that are disaffected from DSLRs stand up and take notice. They're making a lot of users that aren't happy with Micro Four Thirds or even happy with Sony's color science stand up and take notice. And I feel like that's a really powerful thing. I feel like the brand equity that Fuji has, they're willing to remake cameras in firmware. That's something that Canon would never do. And that's something that Sony only does extremely belatedly. In terms of fixing overheating in 4K, that came 6 months or more, it feels like at any rate, after the release of the 6500 on the 6300. So in terms of dollar to value, I'd say Fuji got to win it. But, at the same time, it was my Canon that I took out in the rain and not my Sony. And it is my Sony that I'm shooting this video on. So take everything with a grain of salt. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.